July 26, 2022. Professor Derek Abbott stood before the assembled media in Adelaide, his face bearing the satisfied expression of a man who had solved one of the world's greatest mysteries. After 13 years of painstaking investigation, he was ready to reveal the identity of Australia's most famous unknown victim. "We've solved the case," Abbott declared with scientific precision. "The Somerton Man is Carl Charles Webb." The room buzzed with excitement. International headlines would soon trumpet the breakthrough. Australia's 74-year cold case finally solved. DNA technology had apparently succeeded where decades of traditional detective work had failed. The man found on Somerton Beach on December 1st, 1948, with his mysterious coded message, his unidentifiable clothing, and his connection to a woman known only as Jestin, finally had a name. But as reporters filed their stories and the initial excitement faded, something curious happened. The official authorities, who should have been celebrating this breakthrough, remained conspicuously silent. South Australia Police, who had conducted their own DNA analysis on the exhumed remains, offered only that they were cautiously optimistic about the identification. 3 years later, that caution has hardened into something approaching scepticism. No official confirmation has ever been issued. The case files remain sealed, and what was supposed to be the triumphant conclusion to one of Australia's greatest mysteries has instead opened a new chapter filled with even more perplexing questions. Had Carl Webb really been identified? And even if it was Carl Webb, why had solving the mystery of his identity only made everything else even more mysterious than ever? Welcome to Struth, a podcast where we examine Australia's most bewildering mysteries, particularly those where the solutions seem to create more questions than answers. And today's story? Well, it's about how modern science can give us a name while leaving us more baffled about everything else. I'm your host, and today we're diving into the latest chapter of Australia's most enduring mystery, the Somerton Man. This isn't the story of how the case was solved in 2022. This is a story of how that supposed solution has made the mystery deeper, stranger, and more unsettling than ever before. The tale begins with one of the most bizarre death scenes in criminal history, leads through a labyrinth of codes and secret loves, and ends with scientific identification that somehow makes less sense than when the victim was completely unknown. It's a reminder that in the realm of cold cases, getting the answer you've been seeking for decades doesn't necessarily mean you'll understand what that answer really means. To understand why the 2022 identification has proven so controversial, we first need to revisit the extraordinary circumstances that made the Somerton Man Australia's most famous cold case. A puzzle so intricate and bizarre that it seemed to belong more in the realm of spy fiction than suburban Adelaide. December 1st, 1948. A well-dressed man was found dead on Somerton Beach, slumped against the seawall as if he'd simply decided to take a rest and never woken up. But from the moment police began their investigation, nothing about this death made conventional sense. The man appeared to be in his 40s, physically fit, with distinctive facial features and well-developed calf muscles suggesting he might have even been a dancer or an athlete. His clothing was expensive and well-tailored, but every single identifying label had been meticulously removed. Not torn off in haste, but carefully cut away with scissors. The tags from his shirt, his jacket, his trousers, even the maker's label from his tie. The autopsy revealed enlarged organs consistent with poisoning, but no trace of any known toxin could be found in his blood. His stomach contained a pasty substance that might have been his final meal, but offered no clues to his identity. Most puzzling of all, the pathologist found no obvious cause of death. This healthy man in the prime of life had simply stopped living. But the real mystery began when police found a small piece of paper hidden in a secret pocket sewn into the dead man's trouser waistband. On it were printed 2 words in elegant script: Tamam shud, Persian for finished or ended, the concluding phrase of Edward Fitzgerald's translation of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. The scrap of paper had been torn from a book, and after a public appeal, police located the exact copy of the Rubaiyat from which it came. The book had been thrown into the back seat of an unlocked car parked near Somerton Beach on the night the man had died. In its pages, investigators discovered a phone number written in pencil. The number belonged to a woman named Jessica Harkness, though she'd previously been known only by her maiden name, Jessica Thompson. When police showed Jessica the death mask they'd made of the unknown man, witnesses reported that she appeared shocked and seemed to recognise him. But she denied any knowledge of the deceased, claiming she had given her copy of the Rubaiyat to a man named Alfred Boxall during the war. When police tracked down Boxall, he was very much alive and still in possession of his Rubaiyat, creating yet another impossible contradiction. But the most tantalising clue remained unsolved. On the back page of the found Rubaiyat, someone had written 5 lines of letters in a peculiar code. You'll see the sequence of letters in the show notes. Despite decades of analysis by code breakers, linguists, and intelligence agencies, no one has ever definitively cracked this cipher. Some suggested it might be a one-time pad for intelligence work. Others theorised it could be the first letters of lines in a poem, or even instructions for a dead drop. The coders resisted every attempt at solution, adding to the aura of espionage and international intrigue that surrounded the case. The investigation deepened when police discovered an unclaimed brown suitcase at Adelaide Railway Station. Inside the suitcase were clothes that matched the dead man's size and style, but again, every identifying label had been systematically removed. Most intriguingly, some items were marked with the name T. Keane, but there was no T. Keane among the missing persons reported to police. The suitcase also contained a stenciling brush, American-made scissors, and an assortment of personal items that offered tantalising hints about the man's identity while revealing nothing definitive. For 74 long years, the Somerton Man remained Australia's great unsolved mystery, a perfect storm of impossible evidence, missing identities, and unanswered questions that seemed designed to frustrate conventional investigation. Until Professor Derek Abbott decided to apply the cutting edge of genetic science to this forensic investigation. Abbott's journey to identify the Somerton Man began in 2009, not with scientific ambition, but with personal curiosity. As an electrical engineering professor at the University of Adelaide, he found himself fascinated by the mathematical aspects of the unsolved code and the logical puzzles surrounding the case. What started as academic interest evolved into obsession. Abbott began collecting every scrap of evidence, every police report, every witness statement from the original investigation. He traced family trees, analysed photographs, and even married Rachel Egan, the granddaughter of Jessica Thompson, in a development that added yet another layer of personal connection to the mystery. But Abbott's real breakthrough came when he realised that traditional DNA analysis might be possible using an unconventional source. Hair strands embedded in the plaster death mask that was made in 1949. Working with American genealogist Colleen Fitzpatrick, Abbott's team developed revolutionary techniques to extract genetic material from hair shafts that had been preserved in plaster for over 70 years. The process was extraordinarily complex. While normal forensic DNA analysis relies on hair roots, Abbott's team had to work with the hair shaft itself, protected by keratin proteins but potentially contaminated by decades of chemical exposure from the mortuary soap used in the original plaster casting. Using techniques borrowed from electrical engineering, they applied imputation methods to fill gaps in degraded DNA data, ultimately extracting 2 million single nucleotide polymorphisms from the ancient hair samples. The genetic profile was uploaded to genealogy databases, allowing Abbott and Fitzpatrick to construct massive family trees containing over 4,000 individuals. Through this painstaking genealogical detective work, they identified distant relatives on both maternal and paternal sides, eventually narrowing the search to the descendants of 6 siblings born in the early 1900s. Carl, better known as Charles Webb, emerged as the only male in the family group without a documented death record after 1947. Born on November 16th, 1905 in Footscray, Victoria, Webb was an electrical engineer and instrument maker who had served during World War II. He'd married Dorothy Jean Robertson in 1941, but the relationship deteriorated rapidly amid accusations of violence and mental instability. The elimination process was methodical and seemingly irrefutable. Webb had disappeared from all records in April 1947, exactly 18 months before the Somerton Man's body was discovered. His physical characteristics matched the dead man's measurements. His technical background could explain the sophisticated coding. His documented mental health issues, including a suicide attempt in 1946, provided a potential motive for self-destruction. Abbott announced the identification with 99.9% certainty, presenting it as a triumph of modern forensic science over one of history's most intractable mysteries. International media hailed the breakthrough as definitive proof that genetic genealogy could solve even the coldest of cold cases. But there was one detail that Abbott's triumphant announcement glossed over. South Australian police had conducted their own parallel DNA analysis using material from exhumed remains. And their findings remain classified. Despite completing their investigation in December 2023, authorities have never confirmed Abbott's identification. The silence from official channels has grown more conspicuous with each passing month, suggesting that the scientific certainty Abbott claimed might not be as solid as it initially appeared. If Carl Webb really was the Somerton Man, then his identification should have answered the mystery's central question. Instead, it's revealed gaps in the story so significant that some researchers question whether the identification is correct at all. The suicide theory seems the most straightforward explanation for Webb's death. His documented mental health struggles, previous suicide attempt, and the cascade of family deaths in the 1940s paint a picture of a man spiralling towards self-destruction. Abbott suggests Webb may have poisoned himself with digitalis or another exotic toxin that wouldn't have been detectable in 1948, then travelled to Adelaide to die anonymously on a beach far from his Melbourne home. But this theory immediately encounters problems. If Webb intended to commit suicide, why remove all identifying labels from his clothing? Why sew a small piece of paper containing the mysterious words "Tamam Shud" into your trouser waistband? Why create an elaborate coded message in the book that you tore that small piece of paper from? Why dump that book blatantly in a car for someone to find? And why involve an apparently innocent woman like Jessica Thompson by placing her phone number in the abandoned book? These actions suggest planning and purpose that seem so inconsistent with a simple suicide. The espionage theory offers a more complex but potentially more satisfying explanation. Webb's death occurred during the height of Cold War tensions, just months after the Berlin blockade and as fears of communist infiltration gripped Western intelligence agencies. His technical background in electrical engineering could have made him valuable to foreign intelligence services, while his apparent mental instability might have made him a security risk worth eliminating. Gordon Kramer, a long-time researcher of the case, has noted suspicious timing. Webb's death coincided with the mysterious destruction of Australian immigration records from 1948 to 1950, suggesting official efforts to conceal information about foreign agents operating in the country. The sophisticated nature of the code, the precise removal of identifying materials, and the international connections suggested by the Persian poetry all point toward intelligence work rather than personal despair. Indeed, if any of our listeners are familiar with the Isdal woman case from Norway, some of these elements will seem remarkably familiar. The systematic removal of clothing labels has long been presented as one of the strongest pieces of evidence for espionage involvement. And it certainly could be. Professional intelligence operatives are trained to eliminate identifying markers that could compromise their operations or reveal their origins. I think there's another explanation, and that is to do with sensory processing disorder. For anyone who knows someone with sensory processing disorder, and there's a fair number of people in society that struggle with this on a daily basis, they'll know that removal of clothing tags is a pretty common thing. In fact, it's one of the most common manifestations of SPD, absolute compulsion to remove clothing tags. So what makes me think this might apply to the Somerton Man? The tags weren't just removed from the clothes he was wearing when he died. They were also systematically removed from the items in the suitcase. This pattern suggests habitual behaviour rather than operational security for a very specific mission. And consider this, if Webb was so concerned about identifying features that he removed tags from clothing sitting in a suitcase, why on earth would he leave items clearly marked with T. Keane in that same suitcase, his brother-in-law? If this was about eliminating identification, surely those names would have been the first things to go, yet they remained visible and traceable. If I could ask one question of Dorothy Webb before she died, it would be this: did your husband always remove clothing tags in this manner? The answer to that simple question would dramatically shift how we interpret this evidence. If she said yes, it was a lifelong habit that drove her mad when she tried to do the laundry, then the removed tag tells us nothing about espionage and everything about Webb's personal sensory experience. But if she said no, he never did that before, then the systematic tag removal becomes profoundly more sinister. It would suggest that, indeed, if it was Webb who was the Somerton Man, that this behaviour began specifically during his missing 18 months. This would support the theory that he received intelligence training or became involved in activities requiring operational security. But without that answer, we're left interpreting the removed tags through the lens of our existing theories rather than letting the evidence guide us to conclusions. It's a small detail, but it illustrates how much we still don't know about the most basic aspects of Carl Webb's life and habits. But perhaps the most troubling aspect of the Webb identification is what it reveals about the 18 months between his disappearance in April 1947 and his death in December 1948. During this crucial period, after he'd separated from his wife, Carl Webb simply vanished from all records. No employment, no residence, no documented contact with family or friends. How did he support himself? Where did he live? How did he end up in Adelaide? And most puzzling of all is the Jessica Thompson connection. DNA analysis has definitively ruled out any genetic relationship between Webb and the Thompson family, eliminating the long-standing theory that he might have been the father of Jessica's son, Robin. But if Webb had no connection to Jessica Thompson, how do we explain her apparent recognition of his death mask? How did her unlisted phone number end up written in the rubaiyat found near his body? The exact copy of the book where the torn piece of paper ended up sewn into his trouser waistband. The failure of Webb's family to recognise him when his photographs were published across Australia in 1948 and 1949 presents a troubling puzzle. Webb had multiple living siblings in Melbourne when police conducted extensive publicity campaigns seeking identification. His sister Freda was even married to a Thomas Keane, and clothing marked T. Keane was found in the abandoned suitcase. This was well publicised, and yet none of them ever contacted authorities. But to be fair, the 1948 media landscape was vastly different from today's information environment. Not every household had a radio, television hadn't yet arrived in Australia, and newspapers were read by those who could afford them and chose to pay attention. It's entirely possible that Webb's siblings simply never saw the photographs, particularly if they had little reason to follow crime stories in Adelaide newspapers. Moreover, family dynamics in post-war Australia operated under very different social norms. Estrangement wasn't uncommon. Siblings could have bitter fallings out, move across town or interstate, and never speak again. Webb's documented violence and mental instability, his suicide attempt, and his abandonment of his wife might have led to his family deliberately distancing themselves from him. And yet, even accounting for these social factors, the T. Keane connection in the suitcase remains particularly troubling. This wasn't simply a matter of recognising a photograph in a newspaper, it was a direct family name appearing on items belonging to the deceased. The fact that Freda Keane never made this connection or chose not to report it adds a layer of complexity to the family recognition question that social context alone struggles to explain. 3 years after Abbott's announcement, the Somerton Man case exists in a peculiar liminal state, neither fully solved nor completely unsolved, but suspended somewhere between scientific certainty and bureaucratic scepticism. The most significant unanswered question is why South Australian authorities have never confirmed the identification. Their parallel DNA investigation using material from the exhumed remains should have provided definitive verification of Abbott's claims. The fact that their December 2023 report remains classified suggests either that the evidence doesn't meet legal forensic standards or that complications have emerged that contradict the academic findings. This official silence has created an unprecedented situation in cold case investigation. Unofficial researchers claim to have solved one of the world's most famous mysteries, while the authorities responsible for the case maintain diplomatic, non-committal language that has persisted for nearly 3 years. The scientific methodology used has come under increasing scrutiny. Critics question whether viable DNA could survive 74 years of chemical exposure from mortuary soap containing sodium hypochlorite, a substance known to destroy genetic material. The reliance on imputation techniques to fill gaps in degraded data has been characterised by some experts as sophisticated guesswork rather than definitive forensic proof. Perhaps most troubling is the realisation that identifying Carl Webb has somehow made the mystery's central elements, the code, the removed labels, the Jessica Thompson connection, more inexplicable than when the victim was completely unknown. We now have a name attached to actions and circumstances that make even less sense in the context of Webb's documented life history. The coded message remains undeciphered despite the identification. Abbott has suggested it might represent horse racing betting slips, but this theory lacks any supporting evidence and doesn't explain the message's specific format or letter arrangements. After decades of analysis by intelligence agencies and academic cryptographers, the code continues to resist every attempt at solution. And to those of you listening about the Somerton Man for the first time here on this podcast, best of luck cracking that one. Today, the Somerton Man investigation exists in an extraordinary state of suspended animation. Abbott and Fitzpatrick continue their research, confident in their identification and exploring theories about Webb's final months. They've discovered family photographs from the 1920s that show facial similarities to the Somerton Man. and AI-assisted facial reconstruction supports their claims. Meanwhile, South Australian authorities maintain their cryptic silence, neither confirming nor denying the identification that dominated international headlines. The bureaucratic mystery has been as compelling as the original forensic puzzle, suggesting that resolution may depend more on official politics than scientific evidence. The research community, not surprisingly, remains deeply divided. Academic supporters argue that breakthrough forensic techniques require new approaches to validation, while critics contend that extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. Proof that hasn't been provided through traditional peer-reviewed channels. Interestingly, recent investigations have revealed that Webb's wife Dorothy eventually moved to Butte, South Australia, just 89 miles from Adelaide, and filed for divorce in 1951, citing desertion. If Webb had died in Adelaide in 1948, Dorothy was living nearby without any apparent knowledge of his fate. This geographical proximity raises yet another layer of questions about what really happened during Webb's missing 18 months. The case has become a cautionary tale about the limits of modern forensic science. While DNA analysis can provide compelling evidence about identity, it cannot necessarily explain the complex human motivations and circumstances that transform ordinary people into extraordinary mysteries. As the sun sets over Somerton Beach, casting long shadows across the sand where an unknown man was found 77 years ago, I find myself thinking about the strange relationship between knowledge and understanding. We live in an age where science can extract DNA from 70-year-old hair, where computers can build family trees from fragments of genetic code, and where technology promises to solve mysteries that have confounded generations of investigators. And yet, the story of Carl Webb, if indeed he was the Somerton Man, reminds us that knowing someone's name doesn't necessarily mean we understand their story. In fact, sometimes identification can make a mystery more mysterious, revealing just how much we don't know about the circumstances that transform ordinary lives into extraordinary puzzles. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the Somerton Man case in 2025 is that we may finally know who he was, but we understand less than ever about why he became a mystery in the first place. The elaborate staging of his death, the removed labels, the coded message, the connection to Jessica Thompson, all of these elements seem more inexplicable in the context of Carl Webb's documented life than they did when he was completely unknown. Truth. Sometimes solving the mystery just reveals how much mystery remains unsolved. Thanks for listening to Struth. If this tale of scientific breakthroughs and bureaucratic mysteries kept you questioning what we really know about the past, follow us wherever you get your podcasts. I'd really appreciate it if you took the time to recommend the podcast to a friend, give us a rating, make a comment. These things really help independent podcasts, and I've been blown away by the support that I've received so far. So thank you to all of you that are listening in every week. Next week, we'll stay on the beaches of Adelaide and explore the chilling case of the Beaumont children. 3 siblings who vanished from an Adelaide beach in 1966, leaving behind one of Australia's most heartbreaking unsolved mysteries, and a nation that has never stopped searching for answers. But until then, remember that sometimes the answer you've been seeking for decades raises more questions than it resolves, and the most profound mysteries may be found not in what we don't know, but in what we discover we never understood at all. Stay curious, stay questioning, and I'll catch you next time.